All right, folks, welcome back to the Wall Street Shuffle. Dan Cofall here at 877-777-7713. You can reach us at dan@thewallstreetshuffle.com, and feel free to send us a text, and we'll try to get your questions on the air if you don't want to come on the air. We have an interesting guest today, and I've wanted to have this gentleman on for some time. He doesn't do a lot of radio interviews, but there's a lot of perceptions and misperceptions about this gentleman out there, and we'd like to get a chance to cover those. We've got William Ayers with us today. Bill, first of all, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
I've been struggling on how to introduce you, and I guess the best way to say is that you're an American elementary education theorist, and you are also a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago at the College of Education. You're an author. You've written several books. I guess certainly one of the books that you're most famous are your memoirs called Fugitive Days. Lots and lots of questions that our audience has asked me to ask you, but the one thing that I want to start off with, I get frustrated when somebody takes me completely out of context. And I like to say, whether you like me or whether you don't like me, make sure that you don't like me for the right reasons. There's all kinds of things. Pardon me?
I said that's great. Terrific.
Yeah, and then there's all kinds of things out there in the media about you, and I have no idea who you are until we talk. First, I'd love to know who was the Bill Ayers in the 60s, and now, second, I'd love to know who is Bill Ayers today.
Well, I'm the same person. I'm 64 years old, so I'm a bit older and more worn, but at the same time, I don't feel that there's a great disjunction between episodes of my life. I am, as you say, a distinguished professor of education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I write books mostly about urban kids in trouble. It's also true that during the 1960s, that great moment of both hope and despair, I was the leader of the student movement, the anti-war movement. I was an active participant in the civil rights movement, and I was arrested. I was first arrested opposing the war in Vietnam in 1965 at a draft board in Ann Arbor, Michigan. At that time, I think something like 70% or 80% of Americans supported the war in Vietnam. 3 short years later, about 65% of Americans opposed that war. And we felt, those of us who were anti-war activists at the time, that we had won a great victory. We knew that the civil rights movement, that leaders of the civil rights movement, notably today Martin Luther King, had come out forcefully against the war and had helped turn the tide. We knew that vets were coming home and telling people that what they were asked to do there was unconscionable, and we knew that the war was unpopular. And when Lyndon Johnson, in March of that year, announced that he would not rerun for president, but rather would try to end the war in Vietnam, we felt absolutely celebratory. So on March 31st, at the University of Michigan and elsewhere, we had a huge rally, and we said the war is going to end. In fact, the president of the university said to me that night, "Congratulations, now the war will end." 5 days later, Martin Luther King was dead. A few months after that, Robert Kennedy was dead, and a few months after that, the war escalated into Cambodia, Laos, and so on. So here we were. The anti-war movement was at a turning point. What should we do? 2,000 people were being needlessly murdered by our government, and we didn't know what way to turn. Some people joined the Democratic Party and tried to bring a peace wing into it. Some people ran away to Canada or Europe or Africa. Some people went to the communes of the Northeast and the West Coast. And I and a few other people, a small number of other people, formed a group called the Weather Underground and decided we would make the making of war very, very difficult. We would cross lines of legality, propriety, and that we would destroy property as a screaming alarm against war. That's what you're referring to when you say that I'm well known in the media. I'm the one who Sarah Palin accused of being an unrepentant domestic terrorist. I reject that entirely, out of hand.
Well, Bill, let me ask you this. It's not unusual for an event or an epiphany in someone's life to move them from thought to action. It happened with our founding fathers during the Revolutionary War. It happened with the abolitionists during the Civil War. It probably could happen to Americans today if they felt that their First or Second Amendment rights were going to be threatened. What was the epiphany that you had that moved you from thought to action? Was it the conversation with Johnson? Was there a single event that made you say, I'm going to stop talking about this and I'm going to do what I think, giving you credit for doing what you thought was right, doing what you did? What moved you to action?
Well, I grew up a child of privilege, and I document this in my memoir, Fugitive Days. I grew up a child of enormous privilege in Chicago. I went to the University of Michigan in 1963, and as I blinked my eyes awake, I saw a world in flames. And I took the injunction of Martin Luther King quite seriously. You cannot believe that you are a moral person unless you're willing to act on the things you understand. Now, I grant that our understandings are always impartial, always contingent. We don't know everything. But I instinctively felt that the segregation of black people in the South was wrong, and I acted on that. I instinctively felt that going 10,000 miles away to conduct a war was unjust and unnecessary. So I acted. And those actions brought me new consciousness. So at the age of 18, I was, or 19, I was arrested opposing the war. I joined my first picket line. This was not in my family history. This wasn't something that was expected of me. But each step I took made my commitment to take the next step to end the killing, for example, in Vietnam, more inevitable. And I've been an activist my whole adult life. And frankly, I trace my activism to the spirit and the lessons of Martin Luther King.
Bill, you were quoted as saying that, to the response to the question, would you do it again? The it was a bit of an ambiguous question, but your response was, I don't want to discount the possibility. First of all, what was the it that they were referring to, and what would make you do whatever it was? What would make you do it again?
What I've said many times, and I've been quoted many times saying, is that I have no regrets. And what I mean by that isn't that I don't regret some actions I've taken or some attitudes I've had or some mistaken perceptions. I regret a lot. As I say, I'm 64 years old. If your eyes are slightly open, you have regrets every day. On the other hand, what I'm asked to regret is taking extreme action against the war in Vietnam. And that's what I don't regret. I don't regret opposing this government when it was fighting an illegal, immoral, unjust war. I don't regret opposing it with every fiber of my being. I never said, and if you read my book, you'll see that I never defend the actions that I took. What I do say is we didn't do enough, and by that I mean we weren't smart enough, we weren't organized enough, we weren't generous enough, we weren't militant enough to end this war when it should have been ended, which is right at the beginning. So 3 million people needlessly lost their lives. Now, in retrospect, we're all against the war in Vietnam, I suppose, and in retrospect, only 3 million died and not 300 million. But when you're living in history, you have no idea. And just like today, we don't know what the war on terror portends for us. We don't know what countries it will lead us into. We don't know how many people will suffer. And not knowing calls on us to act on partial knowledge. I acted on partial knowledge. Some of my actions were foolish. Some of them were inarticulate. But I don't regret the acting against that illegal and immoral war.
I wanted to bring up the terrorism issue in the second segment, but let me get us started on that right now. You have said that you condemn all acts of terrorism. How would you deal with groups like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, the border drug wars, or even violent street gangs in Chicago, of which they are numerous? How would you choose to deal with those acts of terrorism?
Well, I'm glad you put those all together because violent street gangs in Chicago is a case in point. Violent street gangs in Chicago commit crimes. Crimes require a criminal justice response, which means we seek evidence, we look for perpetrators, we punish perpetrators. But what Al-Qaeda did in the United States, and to our interests overseas as well, but what they did on 9/11 was without a doubt a crime against humanity. It was without a doubt a pure, unadulterated act of terror. And that requires a criminal justice response, which means it doesn't mean you don't mobilize an army, but you don't use the war metaphor, because the war metaphor lets you get away with murder in a way that's unconscionable. So here we are in Iraq for what? Here we are, we're going to escalate in Afghanistan for what? People committed a crime against humanity.
Hold that thought. I want to come back and pick up exactly where we left off at the beginning of the next segment. Folks, stay with us. Bill Ayers, Dan Cofall here on the Wall Street Shuffle. We'll be right back after these breaks.
This is the BizRadio Network, the sound of your money growing.